Ever get that feeling like someone's peeking over your shoulder, reading everything you type? Well, that's kind of what we're diving into today.
Yeah, it's a little creepy when you think about it.
We're going to be unpacking the new privacy policy from DeepSeek R1, that chatbot and AI platform everyone's buzzing about.
Right, right.
Our source material is JPool's breakdown, DeepSeek R1's 10 red flags,
Yeah.
what you need to know
Aha.
before you share your data. It's on his TechFrontiers YouTube channel, by the way.
Great channel. He always gets right to the point.
Absolutely. And this video is no exception. He really digs deep and raises some pretty serious concerns. The
Yeah.
kind that should have any AI enthusiast policymaker like you listening closely.
Yeah, Pool lays out 10 red flags, and each one has, well, major implications for how we regulate AI going forward, for the future of this tech.
So let's get right to it. Red flag number 1. DeepSeek stores all user data on servers located in China. And, given China's approach to data privacy and government access, this is immediately concerning.
Yeah. For anyone outside of China using DeepSeek R1, that's a huge red flag. You got to think, their data is subject to Chinese laws, which, could mean their information is accessible to the Chinese government, potentially without them even knowing or consenting.
It's a tricky situation when it comes to data sovereignty and the reach of international law. It really makes you wonder how we can guarantee data security and user rights when information crosses borders like that, going into jurisdictions with very different legal and ethical frameworks.
And totally. And that actually leads right into Pool's second red flag, the volume and sensitivity of data that DeepSeek collects. I mean, we're talking everything. Keystroke patterns, complete chat histories, even device specifics, and those crash reports.
Wait, so they're capturing everything you type even if you don't send it? That feels invasive, to say the least. What's the justification for collecting that level of detail?
Well, Pool argues it's all about creating these super detailed user profiles. See, keystroke dynamics can actually reveal a lot more than the words you type, like typing speed, hesitations, maybe even emotional states. And when you combine that with chat logs and other data points, DeepSeek can create a pretty accurate picture of someone's personality, habits, maybe even vulnerabilities. It's pretty remarkable.
But also a little unsettling when you think about how this data could be used, right? From targeted advertising to potential manipulation. It's a lot.
Definitely. And for policymakers, this raises a tough question. Where's the line between innovation and exploitation? What are the reasonable limits on data collection? When does it become harmful,
Okay, red flag number 3 is data sharing. DeepSeek's policy allows them to share your data with all sorts of third parties. We're talking advertisers, analytics firms, service providers, even potential buyers if they get acquired.
Yeah, Pool really goes after them on this one because once your data is shared, it's like almost impossible to keep track of, let alone control. You've got this web of entities all with access to sensitive information, the risk of misuse, breaches, unintended consequences. It all just skyrockets.
It's like a snowball effect.
Yeah.
More entities, more risk.
Yeah.
As policymakers, it's like, how do we even begin to untangle that and establish clear accountability? It's a mess.
That's the challenge, isn't it? We need regulations with real teeth that promote transparency, that give individuals more control over how their data is being used and shared, even when it, changes hands multiple times.
Red flag number 4 gets even more concerning. Legal enforcement loopholes. DeepSeek claims the right to share data with law enforcement based on applicable law or to address misleading activity. And those terms, well, they're pretty vague, to say the least. Leaves a lot open to interpretation.
Yeah, the lack of clear definitions is a major concern, and Pool is spot on in highlighting that. I mean, what exactly is misleading activity? Who gets to decide that? It could allow DeepSeek to share data for reasons that, well, users never agreed to, or that violate basic due process.
It's a big deal for policymakers because it could be abused, right? Imagine governments requesting user data for, broadly defined national security reasons, or companies just handing over data to avoid legal headaches. What happens to individual rights then?
It's a slippery slope for sure. We need clear legal guardrails to prevent, that kind of erosion of privacy and free speech in the name of security or corporate convenience. You can't just let them do whatever they want.
All right, red flag number 5, data retention. DeepSeek doesn't actually say how long they keep user data, meaning they could be storing it indefinitely.
That's a big problem, not having a clear retention policy, especially with the potential for data breaches. I mean, the longer they keep it, the bigger the risk. And it also, limits a user's ability to exercise their right to be forgotten. That's becoming a pretty central concept in data protection these days.
It's a total black box, right?
Yeah.
Users have no way of knowing what happens to their data once DeepSeek has it. For policymakers, this really emphasizes the need for regulations requiring companies to establish clear and reasonable data retention policies, don't you think?
Absolutely. We need to move away from indefinite data storage. People should have control over their digital footprint, you know?
Okay, red flag 6 is about tracking, specifically all the tracking they do with cookies. DeepSeek's policy is basically, well, they use cookies extensively, and they even say that disabling them might limit functionality.
Poole argues that this approach limits user choice, makes it kind of coercive. You can disable cookies, sure, but then you might lose key features. So it's like forcing you to accept constant tracking to get the full experience.
That's a problem, especially as AI is used in more essential services, healthcare, banking, things like that. What if you're denied vital services because you opted out of tracking? What kind of precedent does that set?
It's more than an inconvenience at that point. It raises questions about access, discrimination based on tracking preferences. It's serious. And policymakers have to figure out how to regulate cookie usage in a way that, well, protects privacy without creating barriers to essential services. It's a balancing act.
Red flag number 7 is about a really sensitive topic: children's privacy. DeepSeek says they prohibit data collection from users under 14, but they only have a reactive reporting system. No proactive prevention measures.
Yeah, Poole calls them out on this, and rightly so. It's like they're saying, well, we'll wait for someone to complain before we do anything. That's just not good enough. Not when it comes to kids.
Especially with kids. It highlights the need for stronger safeguards, right? I mean, age verification, strong parental controls, and real proactive measures to prevent children's data from being collected in the first place. We can't just be reactive when it comes to protecting children. It's too important.
I totally agree. We need a system that's proactive from the start, one that prioritizes kids' safety and privacy right out of the gate, not as an afterthought.
Okay, so red flag number 8 is the lack of independent oversight of DeepSeek's data practices. There's nothing in their policy about audits or certifications to back up their claims.
This lack of transparency is a big red flag. Without someone checking their work, users have to take DeepSeek at their word. And given everything else, can I really trust that they're actually following their own privacy policy?
It's all about trust and accountability. We need ways to make sure these companies are doing what they say they're doing, some kind of independent verification.
Precisely. Independent audits, certifications, that's a good way to go. Imagine if companies had to go through regular audits by, an outside organization, just to verify that their practices meet certain standards and regulations.
Yeah, like having an independent inspector for data practices, someone who can say, yes, they're playing by the rules.
Exactly. And it would help build trust, not just in DeepSeek, but in the whole AI ecosystem, which is something we desperately need.
Red flag number 9 is all about user rights, or rather, how ambiguous they are. Their policy says that user rights vary based on location and applicable law, which makes it, well, pretty hard to figure out what protections you actually have.
It's a confusing situation for users, and a potentially unfair. Your rights shouldn't depend on where you live. It undermines user confidence, and honestly makes it hard to hold these companies accountable.
And it raises a big question. How do we protect data in a globalized world where information moves across borders constantly? Can we even talk about user rights without a more unified approach to data privacy regulation?
We need to move towards a system that respects basic rights no matter where you are. That's going to take international cooperation for sure, and a willingness to tackle the whole issue of cross-border data. It's complicated, no doubt.
And finally, red flag number 10. It focuses on the corporate transactions clause. DeepSeek's policy says that user data could be transferred to another company during a merger, acquisition, anything like that.
Poole did a great job of highlighting this because it's often overlooked. When companies change hands, user data is often part of the deal. And that raises some big questions about data security, consent, and the potential for things to go wrong.
I mean, imagine you trust a company with your data because they have a good privacy record, and then they get bought by a company with a terrible reputation. What happens to your data? Is your consent still valid?
It's a gray area that needs to be addressed. Policymakers need to step up and make sure user data is protected during these transitions, and that individuals have a say in what happens to their data, even when, the corporate landscape shifts.
So just to recap, Pool's 10 red flags. We've got data storage in China, the extensive data collection practices, that broad approach to data sharing, those legal loopholes, the lack of a data retention policy. Then there's the whole cookie tracking issue, the reactive approach to children's privacy, no independent oversight, those vague user rights, and that corporate transaction clause. It's a lot.
It really is. But the good news is Pool's analysis isn't just a critique, it's a roadmap. It shows us exactly where we need to focus our attention as we build a framework for responsible AI. It's like, here are the pressure points, now let's figure out how to address them.
Yeah, this video, it really is a wake-up call, no doubt about it. But, it's also a chance to get ahead of the game. We're still in the early days of figuring out how to regulate AI. So we have this opportunity, right? We can learn from these red flags, these mistakes, and actually build something better, a framework that encourages innovation, but also, protects people.
It's not a roadblock, it's a roadmap.
Yeah.
I like that. So where do we start? Pool's focused on DeepSeek, but these issues, they're everywhere, right? Oh, absolutely. He makes that very clear, which is why this is so important for policy. A good place to start. Data protection. We need strong laws around how data is collected, stored, shared, the whole thing. Think GDPR, but specifically for AI.
GDPR, that's a high bar. But it wasn't written with AI in mind. What kind of AI-specific rules do we need?
Transparency is a big one. We got to lift the hood on these AI systems, especially the ones making important decisions like loans or healthcare. Policymakers could mandate, explainable AI. Companies would have to explain clearly how their AI reaches its conclusions.
Interesting. So it's not just about protecting the data itself, but about making sure the whole decision-making process is fair and understandable, like an audit trail, but for AI. So we know why the AI is making the choices it makes.
Right. It's about looking at the logic, the potential biases built into the AI itself, and that's going to require, a lot of collaboration between policymakers, legal experts, and, of course, the people actually developing these systems. It's going to be a team effort.
Poole also talked about cross-border data flows. Data is global, it moves in an instant. How do you reconcile national regulations with that reality?
That's where international cooperation is key. We can't expect every country to have the exact same AI rules. It's just not realistic. But we can work towards some common principles, minimum standards, maybe through treaties or international agreements, something everyone can agree on.
Like trade agreements, but for data and AI. A framework that keeps things moving, keeps innovation going, but also protects those core values, those human rights.
Exactly. And it has to be a conversation that keeps going. As technology changes, we adapt. It's not a one-and-done thing.
Poole's criticism of that vague language around law enforcement access, that also needs some policy attention. How do we balance, legitimate security concerns with protecting people's rights?
Yeah, that's a tough one. We need to give law enforcement the tools to address real threats. That's important. But we also need to prevent overreach, protect civil liberties. Maybe policymakers could set clear legal limits, oversight systems for these data requests so they're justified, proportionate, It can't just be a free-for-all.
Checks and balances. They need access, but there have to be safeguards in place to prevent abuse. Makes sense.
It's about building trust, making sure this powerful technology is used responsibly. That's the goal.
That red flag about children's privacy, that one really hit home for me. What can policymakers actually do to protect kids in this world that's increasingly driven by AI?
Being proactive is key. We can't just wait for things to go wrong. Policymakers could look at regulations, stuff that requires age verification, parental controls, real limits on what data can be collected from children.
AI systems that are designed with kids in mind from the beginning.
Yeah.
Safety and privacy is a priority, not an afterthought.
Exactly. And it goes beyond the tech itself. We need to invest in digital literacy, Teach kids, teach parents how to navigate this online world safely, responsibly. It's an essential skill these days.
Poole's point about the lack of independent oversight, that really stood out. How do we create a system where AI development is transparent, accountable, where people can actually trust it?
Audits and certifications are a good starting point. We need clear standards for, what responsible AI development looks like. And then we need third-party organizations to come in and say, yes, this company meets those standards.
It's like a seal of approval, right? For ethical AI. Consumers could look for it. Companies would be incentivized to get that certification. Everyone wins.
Right. And those audits could cover a wide range of stuff, from data practices to the fairness of the AI system. It's comprehensive.
Thinking about all this, it's clear that policy is important. But individuals have a role to play too, right? What can users do to protect themselves in this AI world?
Being aware is the first step. Read those privacy policies. Understand how your data is being used. And don't be afraid to exercise your rights to access your data, correct it, even delete it. Those are your rights.
A new kind of digital literacy, not just knowing how to use the latest app, but understanding AI, your data rights, all that.
Absolutely. And remember, you have power as a consumer. Support the companies doing this right, the ones who prioritize privacy and ethical AI.
It's true. If enough people demand better, the market will have to respond. That's how change happens.
And Poole also brought up a good point about user rights being all over the place, especially when data crosses borders.
Oh.
So how do we make sure everyone has the same protections no matter where they are?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It seems like we need some kind of global agreement, right, on data privacy and AI ethics. But can we do that without, killing innovation or creating a ton of bureaucracy?
It's a challenge, but it's got to happen. Maybe we start by finding some common ground. Are there basic principles that everyone can agree on, like the right to privacy or the right to not be discriminated against by an algorithm? From there, we can build a framework that, allows for some differences between countries while still upholding those core values.
So building a bridge, right, between different legal systems, cultural norms, all of that. But the goal is to create a world where AI benefits everyone while also respecting human rights.
Right. And trust has to be the foundation of that bridge. Trust between countries, governments, companies, and users. Without trust, none of this works.
That final red flag Poole discussed, the corporate transactions clause. How do we make sure data is protected when companies merge, get acquired, go bankrupt, all that?
It's tricky because, well, those things happen all the time, especially in the tech world. Things move fast, but we can't let user data just disappear, right? Maybe policymakers could consider regulations, something that requires companies to notify users, get their consent before transferring data during a merger or whatever.
Give users a voice. Make sure their data isn't treated like, just another asset in some deal.
That's right. It's about respecting personal data, recognizing that people have a fundamental right to control how their information is used, even when the corporate world is doing its thing. It's their data.
This deep dive into DeepSeek's privacy policy, it's been eye-opening. It really feels like we're at this turning point, this crucial moment for AI. The decisions we make now, they'll have a huge impact, not just on the technology, but on society as a whole. It's like we're at this fork in the road, right? Down one path, AI just keeps developing, no guardrails, and we end up with, less privacy, more division. But on the other path, we could actually shape AI to, really benefit humanity while still upholding our values. It's a choice.
Yeah, it's not about stopping progress. It's about steering it, guiding it. Poole's red flags, they show us the warning signs, what to look out for. And honestly, they're not just technical problems, they're social problems. They affect all of us.
That's a good point. With all that data collection, it's easy to focus on, what specific data points they're gathering. But the bigger question is, what does this do to our relationship with technology? If we feel like we're constantly being watched, are we going to trust these systems? I don't know if I would.
And that loss of trust, it has consequences. It can slow down adoption, stifle innovation. It could even impact democracy, participation, if people are afraid to do anything online because they think they're being tracked. That's a scary thought. Policymakers, they got to step up here and make sure AI development is transparent, accountable. That's how you build trust.
So maybe it's more than just specific regulations. Maybe it's a change in how we think about all this. Do we need a digital bill of rights for AI? Something that clearly lays out the basic principles, the things that should guide how AI is developed and used.
That's an interesting idea. We have rights in the real world. It makes sense that we'd need rights in the digital world too, right? So yeah, a right to privacy, a right to own your own data, a right to know how AI is making decisions that affect you, and a right to not be discriminated against by some algorithm. It's about fairness.
But how do you translate those big ideas into actual change? Poole's video gives us a starting point. But putting it into practice, that's hard.
Yeah.
We're talking about changing laws, sure, but also corporate behavior, user expectations, even, how we think about technology as a culture. It's huge.
It's going to take a lot of effort from a lot of different angles. Regulations are important, of course, but so is education. We have to empower users, give them the knowledge, the tools to understand AI, how it impacts their lives, how to protect themselves, how to hold these companies accountable.
So it's got to be more than just knowing how to use the latest gadget, right? Yeah. It's about critical thinking skills, ethical awareness, being an informed participant in this AI-driven world. That's a different kind of literacy.
Exactly. And these are conversations we need to be having everywhere, not just in, government meetings,
Huh.
but in schools, in communities, at home. The more we understand AI, the better we'll be at shaping it, making sure it reflects, our values.
Poole also talked about international cooperation, which makes sense, right? How do we stop the digital world from splitting apart, where every country has different rules, different standards? It could create these data havens or even like ethical clashes. That wouldn't be good.
Diplomacy is going to be key here. Finding common ground, even when countries have different interests, different cultures. International organizations, they can help. Facilitate conversations, develop shared standards, figure out ways to resolve disputes. It's about working together.
Like we're building this global framework for responsible AI, something that respects, each country's laws, but also promotes cooperation, make sure everyone's upholding the same basic values. It's ambitious, for sure.
And the stakes are high. It's not just about avoiding the bad stuff. It's about, unlocking the good stuff. AI has so much potential, right, to help us with climate change, to develop new medicines, to build more inclusive societies. But to get there, we have to get the governance right. It's fundamental.
That's an awesome vision, and it really highlights how this isn't just about mitigating risks. It's about building a better future, a future where AI empowers us. But we got to build it. It's not going to happen by itself.
Right. We have to be intentional, make choices that reflect, what we want the world to look like. AI is not this neutral force. It's a tool. And like any tool, it can be used for good or bad. We get to decide.
Poole's analysis of DeepSeek R1, it's a wake-up call, yeah. But it's also a call to action. It's like, hey, we're not just along for the ride here. We have a say. We have choices to make. We have a responsibility to shape this future.
And it's not too late. We're still writing the story. Every choice we make as policymakers, as tech developers, even as everyday users, it all matters. We decide whether AI becomes a force for good or, well, something we regret.
So let's choose wisely. Thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive, exploring AI, its impact on the world, all that good stuff. See you next time.